I'm really frustrated that I can't get anybody to engage this. I can't tell if it's because I got to work harder at uh, building rapport with somebody, but or I'm tempted to think they just have to ignore it because it destroys their entire theological system, which I honestly believe that this demonstrates many views are impossible if the Bible's correct. I just can't get people to engage it. So I'm going to play it again. So I'm going to play this. No one will engage it, but it destroys their position. Now, to be honest, like it renders it impossible if the Bible's true and historic. Like the things prophesied happened in history, and so we have to ask the question: is this symbolic? Yes, everybody determines that some of it is symbolic, at least. And then ask the question, if this represents literal time periods because you interpret everything literally because you're a doofus, because you're not being careful with the text, is all I mean. Engage this, please. If it's literal, then it's literal. Don't say it's literal and we have to interpret it literal and then go, well, years aren't really 360 days long, so it's not literal. It's a symbolic literal. It's symbolic literal. I mean, this is absurd. It's grasping at straws. Hi, this is going to be a brief overview of one of the reasons I feel that the historical method of interpretation of the Bible is the only actually historically accurate and viable way that this could be understood. I will be presenting other arguments, but this is a particular argument kind of demonstrating why the futurist interpretation of literal days of the time periods of Daniel don't work. So I'm going to have to presume that you're somewhat familiar with the time periods mentioned in the books of the chapters of Daniel 7, 8. And it touches on 9, 10, 7 through 12, basically. And then also Revelation, I believe 11, 12, where these similar periods and symbols are used. But I'm going to focus in on the time periods in a general sense to show some issues with just the interpretation of them being literal days and why that doesn't seem to be possible. Let me zoom in on a quick little overview of a few facts. Okay, so many people know that the Jewish calendar, or the increments in Daniel, 1260, we see right here in the top right corner, 1260 days. There's a 1260, 1290, and 1335 periods mentioned. They're just that days, okay? The preterist and the futurist view tend to read these as literal days either in the past or in the future. The historical flow method would understand these time periods starting with Babylon and Daniel and the statue dream in Daniel 2 as being the starting point of the prophetic time periods in a succession of kingdoms, one after the other, flowing down through history through an interpretive method.
called a day for a year. All groups agree that Daniel's prophecy regarding the Messiah, almost all, that the weeks of years, or the 70 weeks, are 490 days, which represent a day for a year. That's pretty much accepted, okay, by all. So there's that. Okay, but that's separate in Daniel 9 from these other periods. They're mentioned in Daniel 12, and in Revelation, there's a connection there. But here's the question. The increment of 1260 is equivalent to 3.5 years on a lunar calendar. Okay, a lunar calendar would mean, a purely lunar calendar would mean essentially this idea that there's 12 months with 30 days exactly in each month. 12 times 30 is 360. That's a quote unquote lunar calendar, right? So this mention of 1260, that's how many days you have in a lunar year. 3.5 lunar years, 3.5 times 360. Daniel 7, there's this time period, time times and half a time, which is 1 plus 2 plus half of 1, 3.5. It's also called, or at least most people connect them as being the same period, but 42 months, that's 3.5 years of 12-month years, right? If you had this calendar and you times it by 3.5 years, you'd get 42 months exactly, okay? 1,260 days on this calendar, that's exactly 3.5 years. So you could also say the 1290 would be in exactly one more month than 3.5 years, because it'd be 30 more days. And then another month and a half would be the 1335, or adding another month and a half on top of that. Sounds like, okay, yeah, right. But here's the problem with that. So here's just kind of like 12 months, 30 days each, right? The thing is, the Jewish calendar in history, if the 70th week of Daniel is part of the first 69, well, we know how they were reckoning years during that period, and they weren't using a purely lunar calendar because they couldn't. And so we know the first 69 months were not lunar time. We know it wasn't. And we know that those prophecies had to make sense to the original audience and the Jewish people for who the prophecy was for. And because of that, it doesn't make sense. If you believe the 3.5 years is future and it is equal to the 12.
See, people, if you read the different views on Daniel, and the people, you hear this. I even heard this from Rabbi Eduardo from Radar Apologetics, and this is an error of dispensational reckoning. There's so many ways people put this out there, even in the scholarship. But if you're honest with the scholarship, there is no reckoning of the decree to Jesus showing up that actually works on a 360-day year. The way it tries to cram it in, it ignores Jesus' ministry, which is teaching the new covenant, which would not be excluded from the time period, obviously, because the Messiah teaches a ministry. And to try to make it fit, they'll go from like the second decree of Artaxerxes, and then they'll try to make the years shorter. But they weren't told to count days separate from their calendar based on a calendar they're not actually using. They're to count years from the decree. And there's only one that works. It's 457 BC. And it fits perfectly. So when people try to say, oh, multiply it by 360 days, that's all trash. It's all garbage. Because they kept calendar years with each annual festival 1 year apart, and they were not separated by 360 days. That would mess up their calendar year and push the Passover out of season. So in no way from year to year having an annual feast was there 360 days in between each festival. They didn't reckon time that way. So they're to count years, and 1 year is from one Passover to the next Passover. And one Passover to the next Passover is never 360 days apart, ever. And if you tried to do that, or if you tried to do any exact number of days in between an annual festival, you would screw up the calendar because of the way they did it. You cite the moon, and that adjusted the solar year back into effect. So they would I think I'm going to explain that in this recording, but when Daniel wrote the prophecies, they were not keeping a 360 days per year calendar. Okay. We have no historical or archaeological evidence that they operated that way. They were told to sight the moon from moon to moon. So months never had 30 days in them exactly. They would have 29 or 30. And then every so many years they added a 13th month. That month always had 30 days in it, which is kind of interesting because the 1290 is a certain period of time with an extra month added, 30 days. And when they add the 13th month, just food for thought, was the 30-day month is always added. It's always 30 days when they add the 13th month. So when you get a year with 13 months, that month would be 30 more days onto the year, which would give a year about 383 days per year, plus or minus 1 day based on an adjustment that may or may not be made according to when the moon is sighted and when a certain festival in the 8th or 9th month would land on a weekly Sabbath. They would add or subtract a day from that month so that certain festivals didn't fall on a weekly Sabbath. The Passover could fall on a weekly Sabbath, but not other ones. When they added a dar 2 or whatever, a bet. So trying to multiply by 360-day years when you're trying to shrink down your 490 year period to line up with a decree in Jesus, none of those work. None of them. And it's been acknowledged in the literature because it's an error. So when people try to amaze you with, oh, look how it's 177,000 days right to the, no. They counted years, and a year is according to the sighting of the moon, and a year between Passovers is not 360 days. It's 353 days plus or minus a day in a given year based on adjustments that had to be made to keep Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or the Feast of Weeks in the proper season. And seasons are based on a true solar year. So they had made adjustments to keep seasons in their proper order by making adjustments, which means that there is no literal 360-day year calendar, which means rendering in an apocalyptic genre is not literal time period. They're not literal days, 360-day years that they're counting. It's not literal. It's symbolic, a day for a year. Because there is no such thing as 42 months in 3.5 years because they add a month. They have to, or the Passover wouldn't be possible in literal history. Because these periods correlate to literal history, but the increment of days is not literal. It can't be. It's impossible. If our Bible is telling us something that literally happened in history, the increments given are not meant to be taken literal. And Daniel knew that there wasn't 360 days in a year when he wrote these prophecies, which are apocalyptic genre. It doesn't correlate to reality, but people don't care. People don't care because they have theology they've made up because they're dispensational. They don't want to keep the Sabbath. They don't want to see the unity in the church that Jesus brought, that the church was established by first covenant people in the fulfillment of salvation to them first in Jesus. But people want to point the finger and say your replacement theology, and then pretend like Jesus didn't establish the church for his people in the first century, which included the Sabbath, by the way, because it's a sign that he's the God that sanctifies his people. And he did that in the first century because he's the creator. And he established his church with all first covenant people. It was a fulfillment of a promise to them. So anybody who distorts that is replacement theology in the worst way. And now they want Jews to come to Jesus. And then they say the reality is they were told not to follow anybody who took them towards other gods. And any claim that the fulfillment of the new covenant, which was established in the first century, did away with one of the 10 commandments How are they going to join such a thing? Moses warned them if they take you after other gods. And the Sabbath was the sign that Yahweh, the creator God, is the God who sanctifies them. They're never, and they rightfully shall never join a church that says the Sabbath is done away with. So you don't love the Jews. You love your theology. You are the replacement theology if you're dispensational. And I don't blame the Jews for not wanting to join that. It's a false God. Ultimately, for them, that's a false God. Think about this. Jesus establishes the new covenant with his people, and he dies. And as they take him off the cross, they're careful to keep the Sabbath. Were they being legalistic, honoring the Sabbath even when Jesus died? Do you think if Jesus hinted the Sabbath being done away with, they would have? When do you think they would have cared about the Sabbath in burying their own rabbi? What does that tell you? It tells you Jesus said nothing about not honoring the Sabbath. Because if he had, they certainly would have not cared about it while they were taking him off of the cross. So, dispensationalism is replacement theology. And I hope people wake up to this and come back to the faith once delivered to the saints, which Jesus is the Lord of, the God of humanity. And he's the creator, Lord of the Sabbath. Get your priorities straight. You want to win Jews? They're not supposed to come to some false god. They still, think about it. Any Jew worth his salt is going to struggle with that issue because of what Moses said. You want to unite Christians and call the Jews to Messiah? They're not going to do it to some Sunday keeping church. And then the Jews for Jesus out there that pretend like it doesn't matter, and then they actually have Sabbath churches. I'm glad they do. But don't pretend like it doesn't matter. It did matter. Still does. It's one of God's commandments. It's the sign of that he's the creator. It ain't going to change. Can't change that. Don't tell me it doesn't matter.
$160 literal days, which is a literal 3.5 years, and that's associated with the 70th week of Daniel in the future. Why would the 70th week render a different kind of years than the other 69? The other 69 were not rendered by a lunar calendar because they didn't use a lunar calendar. And the prophecy was to them. That's the original context. So I want to go into just a brief overview of the evidence of that and some reasons for it logically and historically. Okay, so this is from Wikipedia. It seems very accurate. I've checked it with other sources. This isn't in contention. Nobody's attesting this that I can find. The Hebrew calendar is a lunisolar calendar. What does that mean? Meaning the months are based on lunar months. So in other words, the months are based on the moon. That's where the word comes from, the sighting of the moon. So within a year, they're basing their calendar off, originally anyways, off the sighting of the moon. But they actually some days would have, some months would be reserved to have 29 or 30 because they would make it so certain days didn't fall on certain, like the Sabbath, okay, is what they say. But because of this, there's reasons why it can't be 360 because that's, short of a true solar year. So in other words, it's lunisolar because they're operating within the year off of the month, off of the moon. But it's solar because they have to adjust it so that the year is not short of days of a true solar year. Because if it were, every year they would fall behind more and more and more. And that's a problem, which you'll see why. So it's lunisolar because it's based on lunar months, but the year is based on an actual solar year. Okay, so the calendar year features 12 lunar months based on the moon of 29 or 30 days. Why is that? Well, with an intercalary lunar month added periodically to synchronize the 12 lunar cycles within a year with the longer year, which would be the true solar year. Okay, so they have leap years. What is that? Or leap months, I mean. The beginning of each Jewish lunar month is based on the appearance of the new moon, although originally the new lunar crescent would have to be observed and certified by witnesses in biblical times. The moment of the true moon is now approximated medically or arithmetic, with arithmetic, as the molad, which is the mean new moon to a precision of 1 part. The mean period of the lunar month is very close to, on average, 29.5 days. Accordingly, the basic Hebrew calendar year is one of 12 lunar months alternating between 29 and 30 days. See, that would make it so it's not actually 360. And then it gives examples there. So what's the reason for these leap months? Adding a 13th month, okay? They actually, I don't think I put it in here, which I meant to, but it's essentially it's the cycle of 19 years, and 12 of the years would be 12-month years, and then 7 out of the 19 have the extra month. That's what it equals out to be, which is about every 3 years. A little bit more than that. So notice, less than every 3 years they add a 13th month. What is this period called? It's called 3.5 years. You know what that means? That means there's never an increment or a stretch of time anywhere in any period of 490 years that you get 1260 days in a period of 3.5 years, no matter where you start it. Because before every third year, no more than every third year, they have to add the 13th month. So you never historically